Eleanor Mitchell had always believed that at 72 years old, the least she could expect from life was the respect of the children she had raised. She had fed them through chickenpox and measles, had sewn their Halloween costumes by hand when money was tight, had held their small bodies against hers during thunderstorms, and whispered that everything would be all right. She had given them everything a mother could give. Instead of respect, she received an eviction notice. The October morning was unseasonably warm for Willowbrook, Tennessee. Golden light filtered through the maple trees that lined Chestnut Street, painting the sidewalk in shifting patterns of amber and shadow. It was the kind of morning that should have felt like a gift. Eleanor stood on that sidewalk now, watching her 3 children load the last of her belongings into a donation truck. Not a moving truck, not a storage truck. A donation truck operated by strangers who would sort through 40 years of her accumulated life and decide what was worth keeping and what deserved to be thrown away. They were not even keeping her things. They were donating everything like she was already gone, already someone who no longer mattered. Clayton, her oldest at 46, supervised the operation with the detached efficiency of a man clearing out a storage unit rather than dismantling his mother's home. He was tall like his father had been, with the same strong jaw and capable hands. But somewhere along the way, the warmth that had defined Emmett Mitchell had failed to take root in their son. He checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Mom, you really need to move now." His voice carried no emotion, just the flat tone of a man who had already moved on to the next item on his mental checklist. He did not look at her. He had not really looked at her in years. "The new owners are coming tomorrow morning to start renovations. You cannot be here when they arrive. It would be awkward for everyone." Awkward. That was the word he chose. Not tragic, not unjust, not heartbreaking, awkward. Eleanor looked at the house where she had lived for 25 years. It was a modest 2-story structure with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch that Emmett had built with his own hands the summer before he got sick. The garden she had tended for decades had grown wild in recent months as her arthritis worsened, but the roses Emmett had planted for their 20th anniversary still bloomed stubbornly along the fence. Their crimson petals were a defiant splash of color against the peeling white paint. It was not much. It had never been grand or impressive, but it had been hers in the way that mattered. She had lived there since Emmett died 20 years ago, paying rent faithfully every single month to old Mr. Callahan, who had seemed kind enough. He had told her she could stay as long as she needed. He had said he understood what it was like to be alone. She had never missed a payment in 2 decades, had kept the place clean and maintained despite her limited income from the alterations work she still took in, had patched the roof herself when she could not afford a contractor, had painted the porch railings every spring because Emmett had always said a house needed to look loved to feel like a home. But 3 months ago, Mr. Callahan had passed away peacefully in his sleep at 91. His nephew, a man Eleanor had never met who lived in Atlanta and saw the property only as numbers on a spreadsheet, had immediately sold it to developers who planned to tear it down and build something modern and profitable. And Eleanor, who had never had a formal lease, just a handshake agreement with a man now gone, just a verbal promise that meant nothing in the eyes of the law, had no legal right to stay. Her children could have helped her fight it. Clayton knew lawyers through his accounting firm. Nadine had connections at the real estate company where she worked. Wesley could have helped her find an apartment, could have co-signed a lease, could have done any of the 1,000 small things that children do for parents who need help. Instead, they had shrugged. "It is probably for the best," Nadine had said at the family meeting 3 weeks ago, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. "You should move into some kind of facility where you will be properly taken care of by professionals, people trained for that sort of thing." As if Eleanor was an object requiring specialized handling rather than their mother who had devoted her entire life to raising them. Eleanor had refused absolutely. She was not going to some facility to sit in a communal room playing bingo while waiting to die. She was not going to surrender the last shreds of her independence and dignity to become another elderly person warehoused until death. So her children had simply stopped helping, stopped calling except to ask when she would be out, stopped visiting, started treating her like she was already gone, already erased from their lives. And now, here she was, standing on a sidewalk that would not be hers in 24 hours, watching strangers carry away 40 years of accumulated possessions while her children supervised with the detached efficiency of people clearing out a storage unit they had rented too long. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Eleanor asked quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Nadine finally looked at her, but the expression on her daughter's face was not compassion. It was exasperation mixed with what might have been guilt, but looked more like irritation at being made to feel guilty. Mom, we have been over this 100 times. Nadine's voice carried the patronizing patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a difficult child. You cannot stay with any of us. We literally do not have room. Wesley has the new baby, and his house is already crowded. I travel constantly for work. Clayton's wife has made it very clear she does not want long-term house guests. We are not being mean, Clayton added, still not looking up from his phone. We are being realistic. We told you months ago to apply for senior housing. I did apply, Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. I applied to every facility within 30 miles. There is a waiting list for all of them, 9 months minimum, most of them over a year. They told me that explicitly. I cannot just magically make a space appear. Well, that is not our fault, is it? Wesley spoke for the first time, and his voice carried an edge that made Eleanor's heart constrict. Her baby, the one she had rocked through colic for months, the one who used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms and tell her she was the best mommy in the whole world. You should have planned better, Mom. You should have saved money over the years. Should have had something in place for emergencies. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead. The words landed like physical blows. Eleanor understood something in that moment that she had spent years refusing to see. Her children blamed her for being poor, blamed her for not having savings and backup plans and safety nets, blamed her for the crime of having devoted every dollar and every ounce of energy to raising them instead of building a fortress of financial security for her old age. They blamed her for sacrificing everything for them, and they resented her for needing anything in return. I have somewhere to go, Eleanor said suddenly, the words coming before she had fully formed the thought. Desperation was creating an escape plan in real time. Grandma Maggie's old property. The main house is gone, but the land is still in the family trust. There is a basement structure built into the hillside behind where the house stood. It is still there. I can stay there. Her 3 children looked at each other and actually laughed. Not nervous laughter or uncomfortable chuckling, genuine amusement at what they clearly considered a ridiculous idea. That old place. Clayton shook his head, a condescending smile on his face. Mom, that property has been abandoned for 16 years since the house burned down. There is no electricity, no running water, probably no roof left that does not leak. You cannot seriously think you can live there. It is not even a real house. It is a hole in the ground. I am not asking your permission. Something in Eleanor's voice made all 3 of them stop and actually look at her for the first time that morning. Really look at her. And what they saw made them uncomfortable, though they would never admit it. They saw a woman who had been pushed past the point where she cared about their approval. A woman who had finally understood that the children she had sacrificed everything for had no intention of sacrificing anything for her. A woman who had nothing left to lose and was therefore, for the first time in decades, truly free. I am telling you where I will be, Eleanor continued, her voice steady now, carrying a quiet authority that surprised even herself. If you need me for anything, though I sincerely doubt you will, that is where I will be. If you ever decide you actually care what happens to me, you will know where to find me. Not that I am holding my breath waiting for that particular miracle. She picked up her single suitcase, the only thing they had agreed to let her keep from an entire household of possessions, and started walking down the sidewalk. Behind her, she heard Clayton's voice, dismissive and cold, carrying clearly in the morning air. Let her go. Give her a week, maybe 2 at most. She will come crawling back when she realizes she cannot handle living in a basement like some kind of homeless person. Then maybe she will be reasonable about accepting a facility placement instead of making everything so difficult. Eleanor kept walking. Each step took her further from the children who had failed her, and closer to a place she had not visited in 40 years. A place her grandmother Margaret Hayes had called her sanctuary. A place connected to a promise made on a deathbed 4 decades ago. Words that had seemed meaningless at the time, but that Eleanor had nevertheless remembered. When you have nowhere left to go, Maggie had whispered, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail, her eyes bright with urgency despite the morphine. When you have lost everything, go to the sanctuary. I left you something there, something important, something that will save you when you need it most. Promise me you will remember, Eleanor. Promise me. Eleanor had promised. She had held her dying grandmother's hand and thought it was just the rambling of someone whose mind was fading. Now, 40 years later, she was finally going to find out what Maggie Hayes had meant. The property that had once belonged to Margaret Hayes sat exactly 2 miles outside of Willowbrook, far enough from town to feel truly isolated, close enough that Eleanor could walk there in about an hour if she moved slowly and carefully. The walk gave her time to think, time to remember. Margaret Hayes had immigrated to America from County Cork, Ireland in 1922. She had arrived at Ellis Island with a single trunk containing everything she owned in the world. She had been 19 years old, alone, fleeing a country still reeling from civil war, and a family that had crumbled under the weight of poverty and loss. She had made her way to Tennessee because a distant cousin had written that there was work in the textile mills, that Irish girls could find jobs and husbands and new beginnings. Maggie had found all three. She had worked in the mills for 15 years, had married a carpenter named Thomas Hayes, had bought 20 acres of land outside Willowbrook, and built a life from nothing but determination and hope. Eleanor had adored her grandmother, had spent every summer of her childhood on that property, following Maggie through the vegetable garden, learning to can tomatoes and preserve peaches, listening to stories of the old country told in Maggie's lilting accent that never quite faded despite 60 years in America. Maggie had been the one who taught Eleanor to sew, had guided her small hands through the mystery of needle and thread, had shown her how fabric could become anything if you had patience and skill and vision. There is magic in making something beautiful from nothing, Maggie used to say. Do not ever let anyone tell you that women's work is not important. We create, we mend, we hold the world together one stitch at a time. The main house had burned down in 2008, an electrical fire that destroyed everything above ground. Eleanor had been 56 then, still raw from Emmett's death 4 years earlier, still struggling to find her footing as a widow in a town that had never quite accepted her. She had not been back to the property since the fire, had not been able to face the ruins of the place where she had been happiest as a child, but she remembered the basement. Not a basement under the house, but a completely separate structure, a root cellar that Thomas Hayes had built sometime in the early 1940s, dug deep into the hillside behind where the house had stood. It was an old-fashioned design, the kind of storage space people had created before reliable refrigeration, meant to keep vegetables and preserves cool through summer and from freezing in winter. Maggie had used it for exactly that purpose, but she had also treated it as something more, a private space, a place that was entirely hers. My sanctuary, Maggie used to call it, with a particular emphasis that suggested it meant more than just a storage room. The only place that is entirely mine, where I can think and breathe and be myself without anyone watching or judging or needing something from me. Eleanor had been 32 years old the last time she visited that sanctuary, just 2 years before Maggie's death, just 4 years before the scandal that would destroy her reputation and nearly destroy her entirely. She had blocked out most of those memories deliberately. The pain had been too deep and too sharp to examine without breaking. But now, walking up the overgrown path toward where the house had once stood, she let herself remember, piece by piece, the way you might carefully unwrap a wound that had never properly healed. The house was gone completely. Nothing remained except a concrete foundation overtaken by aggressive weeds and small trees that had taken root in the cracks. Nature had reclaimed the space enthusiastically, erasing almost all evidence that humans had ever lived there. 16 years of Tennessee weather had done what time always does, reducing human efforts to rubble and returning the land to wildness. But beyond the foundation, built into the hillside exactly as Eleanor remembered, was the basement entrance. A heavy wooden door set into mortared stone, weathered and moss-covered, but still fundamentally solid. The door was smaller than Eleanor remembered, but everything from childhood memory seemed larger than reality. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, covered in decades of oxidation, looking like it might disintegrate if touched too roughly. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something she had kept for 40 years without fully understanding why. A small brass key on a tarnished chain. Maggie had pressed it into her palm the day before she died. Her grip had been surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Her eyes had been bright with urgency despite the morphine clouding everything else. For the sanctuary, Maggie had whispered, her voice barely audible but intense with meaning. When you need it most, when you have nothing left, remember Eleanor, promise me you will remember. Eleanor's hands shook badly as she fitted the key into the padlock. It stuck at first, decades of rust and corrosion fighting against her, but she twisted harder, using both hands and all her remaining strength. With a grinding screech that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, the lock opened. The door itself was much harder, swollen with moisture and age, warped by decades of weather. It took all of Eleanor's strength to pull it open even an inch. She braced her feet against the rocky ground, grabbed the old iron handle with both hands, and pulled with everything she had. The door fought her, groaned in protest, but finally gave way with a sound like tearing fabric. A cloud of musty air rushed out when the door opened. It carried the scent of earth and old wood and something else. Something faint but unmistakable. Lavender. Maggie's scent. The smell she had carried with her always. The perfume that had seemed to fill any room she entered. That had clung to her clothes and her hair. That had meant safety and love and home to a little girl spending summers in the Tennessee countryside. Eleanor pulled a small flashlight from her suitcase, one of the few practical items her children had allowed her to keep, and clicked it on with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was larger than she remembered. The root cellar stretched back into the hillside with a curved ceiling of mortared stone and heavy timber beams. Shelves lined the walls on both sides. Most were completely empty now, some still held ancient mason jars covered in dust and cobwebs, their contents long since spoiled and forgotten. But at the very back of the basement, illuminated clearly in her flashlight beam, sat a large trunk, dark wood bound with brass fittings, exactly as Eleanor remembered it from childhood. Maggie's hope chest, the trunk she had brought with her when she immigrated to America in 1922, the trunk that had carried everything she owned across an ocean and into a new life, the trunk that had held her most precious possessions throughout her entire existence. Eleanor walked toward it slowly, her flashlight beam steady despite her trembling hands. She could barely breathe, could barely think past the pounding of her heart. The trunk was sealed with red wax. The seal was unbroken after all these years, perfectly preserved, and pressed into the wax was Maggie's cameo ring, the one she had worn every single day of her life, the one she had been buried without because she had secretly taken it off beforehand and hidden it here. This was not just locked away, this was sealed, preserved, protected, meant to last decades, meant to be found at exactly the right moment. Eleanor set down her flashlight carefully, positioning it so the beam illuminated the trunk fully. Then, with hands that had done delicate seamstress work for 50 years, hands that knew how to be gentle and precise, she carefully broke the wax seal. The lid was heavy, solid wood that had not warped despite the decades, but it opened smoothly on hinges that had been well made and had lasted. And there, filling the trunk completely, preserved carefully in layers of tissue paper and scattered lavender sachets, was a wedding dress. Not just any wedding dress, Eleanor's wedding dress, the one she had made with her own hands in 1988, the one she had never worn, the one from the wedding that had been canceled because of lies and scandal and cruelty, the one that represented the happy beginning that had been stolen from her. Eleanor stared at the dress, unable to breathe, unable to think, as decades of carefully suppressed memories came flooding back with crushing, overwhelming force. She had been 36 years old in 1988, working as a seamstress in Willowbrook, running a small alterations business from a rented shop on Main Street, taking in work from the few people in town who valued quality craftsmanship over the cheap, ready-made clothes that were becoming more common every year. She had met Emmett Mitchell on a Tuesday in March. He had come to her shop with a request to repair a tear in his late wife's favorite quilt, a family heirloom that had been damaged when his youngest son, Wesley, then just 5 years old, had tried to build a fort and accidentally ripped a seam. Emmett had been a widower for 2 years. His wife, Carolyn, had died of a sudden aneurysm, leaving him alone with 3 children under the age of 10. He was 42 years old, working as a carpenter with gentle hands and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "I know it is just fabric," he had said that first day, holding the damaged quilt like it was something precious. But it mattered to her. And the kids, they still sleep with it sometimes, when they miss their mama. Eleanor had looked at this man with sawdust in his hair and grief in his eyes, and she had seen something that made her heart catch. Not romance, not at first, just recognition. The recognition of one lonely person seeing another, the understanding that passes between people who have learned to carry their pain quietly because the world does not have patience for grief that lasts too long. "I can fix it," she had told him. "Come back Thursday." She had spent 3 days on that quilt, far more time than a simple repair required. She had matched the thread exactly to the original stitching, had reinforced the worn areas that would have torn again within months, had treated the fabric with care that went beyond professional obligation. When Emmett came back on Thursday, she had handed him the quilt and watched his face as he examined her work. "It looks better than before," he said quietly, wonder in his voice. "How did you do that?" Magic, Eleanor had replied, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had smiled. Really smiled. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes and changes your whole face. Emmett had smiled back. Within 3 months, he was coming to her shop every week, bringing things that needed mending, staying to talk while she worked, telling her about his children, his carpentry, his dreams of someday building furniture that people would pass down through generations. Within 6 months, Eleanor understood that she loved him, loved his gentleness and his patience, loved the way he saw beauty in wood and craft and careful work, loved the way he treated her like someone whose thoughts mattered, whose opinions had value, whose presence brightened his days. Within 8 months, they were engaged. Eleanor had made her own wedding dress, pouring all her skill and hope and desperate longing for a fresh start into every single stitch. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever created, ivory silk with delicate lace applique that she had sewn by hand over the course of 3 months. Fitted bodice and flowing skirt, elegant and timeless. The wedding was set for June 15th, 1988. The church was booked, Willowbrook Community Church, the largest and most respected in town. Invitations had been sent, flowers ordered, a small reception planned at the community hall. For the first time in her life, Eleanor had allowed herself to believe that happiness was possible, that the loneliness she had carried since her parents' deaths in a car accident when she was 24 might finally lift, that she might have a family again, a husband who loved her, children who would call her mother, a future that held more than work and solitude. And then Reverend Carlton Ashford had destroyed everything. He had been 38 years old that year, handsome in a way that made people trust him, charismatic in a way that filled the church every Sunday, married with 2 children, beloved by the congregation, powerful in the way that religious leaders can be powerful in small southern towns where church membership determines social standing and community belonging. Eleanor had first noticed something wrong during the wedding planning meetings. Compliments that felt excessive. "You have the most beautiful hands I have ever seen on a woman," he had said once, watching her take notes. So delicate, so skilled. She had thanked him politely and changed the subject, but the comment had lingered in her mind, leaving a residue of discomfort she could not quite name. Then came the touches. A hand on her shoulder that stayed there seconds too long, fingers brushing her arm when he handed her papers, standing too close when they reviewed details, always with a smile, always with plausible deniability, and the looks, the way his eyes moved over her body when he thought she was not paying attention, the way he smiled when she shifted away from him, like her discomfort was amusing, like her resistance was a game. Then came the corners. The moments when she found herself somehow alone with him despite having arrived with Emmett. The whispered suggestions that made her skin crawl. "You should come to my office sometime, just the 2 of us, to discuss the ceremony in more detail. I think about you, Eleanor, more than a pastor should think about a woman who is not his wife. No one would have to know. It would be our secret, just between us." Eleanor had refused him every single time. Firmly, clearly, increasingly desperately. "I am engaged to be married," she had said the last time, backing away from him in the church hallway, her voice shaking. "I love Emmett. What you are suggesting is wrong. Please stop." Something had flickered in Ashford's eyes then, something cold and dangerous that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "You will regret this," he had said quietly. His voice had been pleasant, almost conversational, but the words themselves carried a threat that made her blood run cold. "No one refuses me, Eleanor. No one." She had thought about reporting him, but to whom? He was the pastor. He had all the power. He sat on the boards of half the businesses in Willowbrook. He played golf with the mayor. He counseled the police chief's family. Who would believe her accusations against him? So she had simply tried to avoid him, hoping that her clear rejections would be enough, that he would give up and leave her alone, that she could just get through the wedding and then never have to deal with him again. She had been naive. She had been catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. 2 weeks before the wedding, Reverend Carlton Ashford went to the church elders with a story he had carefully crafted and rehearsed. He told them, with tears in his eyes and a voice shaking with what appeared to be righteous anger and betrayed trust, that Eleanor Hayes had come to his office and inappropriately propositioned him, that she had been aggressive and inappropriate, that she had suggested they have an affair, that she had told him she was attracted to him and did not care that he was married, that he had firmly rejected her advances and told her such behavior was sinful, that she had become angry and threatening when he refused her. He said he felt duty-bound to inform the community about her true character before she married an innocent man in God's house. He performed his lie perfectly. A master manipulator who knew exactly how to appear wounded and reluctant and painfully honest. And the elders believed him, instantly, completely, without question. The word of a powerful, respected pastor versus a seamstress with no family in town and no connections to protect her. There was no question whom they would trust, no doubt about whose word carried more weight. Within 24 hours, the story had spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. The wedding was canceled by the church. The pastor who was supposed to officiate refused to participate. The church that was supposed to host them withdrew the invitation. Emmett's family, pillars of the community, and faithful church members for 3 generations begged him to break the engagement. His mother, a woman who had never warmed to Eleanor despite her best efforts, was particularly vicious. "That woman threw herself at Pastor Ashford," she had said at a family meeting that Emmett later described to Eleanor, his voice breaking. "She is trash. She is not fit to be a Mitchell. If you marry her, you are not my son anymore." Emmett had been forced to make an impossible choice, Eleanor or his family, love or belonging, his heart or his history. And Emmett, bless him forever, had chosen Eleanor. "I know who you are," he had said to her on the night his mother issued her ultimatum. They were sitting on the porch of his house, the same porch where they had shared their first kiss. His hands were rough and warm around hers. His eyes were full of grief and determination and love so fierce it made her chest ache. "I know your heart, I know your character, and I know that man is a liar. Your family," Eleanor had whispered, "your children, they will lose their grandmother. My children will have you as their mother, and they will learn that integrity matters more than comfort, that standing up for truth costs something, and it is worth paying." They had married 2 weeks later, quietly at the county courthouse. No family, no friends, no celebration. Just Eleanor in a simple blue dress she had sewn in a week, and Emmett in his Sunday suit, and a justice of the peace who wished them happiness without knowing anything about what they had lost to reach that moment. Emmett's mother had kept her promise. She had cut him off completely, had forbidden his siblings from contacting him, had turned his children's grandparents into strangers overnight, and Willowbrook had turned on Eleanor with the righteous fury of a community that believes itself to be defending decency. She lost most of her customers within a month. People who had praised her work for years suddenly remembered appointments they had forgotten to cancel. Jobs were canceled with transparent excuses. Women who had been friendly crossed the street to avoid her. She heard the whispers everywhere she went. "That is the woman who threw herself at Pastor Ashford." Can you imagine trying to seduce a married pastor? And she went ahead and married that Mitchell man anyway. No shame at all. Emmett lost work too. Contractors who had hired him for years found reasons to use other carpenters. Projects that had been promised were suddenly canceled. His reputation, built over 2 decades of quality craftsmanship, crumbled under the weight of being married to that woman. They survived. They adapted. Emmett found work in neighboring towns where his name was not tainted. Eleanor took in alterations from the few people in Willowbrook who did not care about gossip, or from customers in other places who had never heard the rumors. They had 16 years together, 16 years of being outsiders in the town where Emmett had been born, 16 years of being the couple people whispered about, 16 years of Eleanor being known forever as that woman who threw herself at the pastor. Even their children, the 3 who had been so young when she entered their lives, had grown up with this story as background noise, had grown up with subtle shame about their stepmother's reputation, had absorbed through 1,000 small moments the message that Eleanor was somehow tainted, somehow less than, somehow not quite worthy of respect. They had never quite believed her version of events, never quite trusted her, never quite been able to defend her when people whispered. And when Emmett had finally died of cancer in 2004, leaving Eleanor alone, the old scandal had resurged with renewed vigor. Well, at least now she cannot corrupt that poor man anymore. Probably for the best. He was too good for her anyway. Wonder if she will try her tricks on some other married man now. 20 years she had lived with those whispers. 20 years of carrying a burden that was never hers to bear. 20 years of being judged for something she had never done. And now, in this basement, Eleanor stood holding the wedding dress that represented everything that had been stolen from her. Her hands shook as she lifted the dress carefully from the trunk. The fabric was still beautiful despite its age. The ivory silk preserved perfectly by Maggie's careful packing. The lace applique was still delicate and intact. The stitching, her own work, was still strong and even. But as she lifted it, something felt wrong. The lining was thicker and stiffer than it should have been. Something was inside that did not belong. Eleanor turned the dress over with her seamstress's expert eye, examining the seams and construction she knew as intimately as her own handwriting. There, in the bodice lining, a section that had been opened and re-sewn, not her stitching. She would have recognized her own work instantly, someone else's hand, careful and skilled, but different, hidden. With hands that had steadied with purpose and focus, Eleanor found her small sewing scissors in her suitcase. Carefully, methodically, she cut the re-sewn seam. The lining fell open, and several envelopes tumbled into her lap. Old envelopes, yellowed with decades, addressed in different hands to Margaret Hayes. Eleanor picked up the first envelope with shaking hands, barely breathing. The postmark read, September 1988, just 3 months after the scandal that had destroyed her life. She opened it with careful reverence and unfolded the fragile paper inside. Eleanor is about to discover something that will change everything she thought she knew about the past decades. Before we continue, I want you to pause and consider something. Have you ever suspected that something terrible that happened to you was not the full story? Have you ever wondered if there were people who knew the truth but were too afraid to speak it? Eleanor is about to discover that she was not as alone as she thought, that the truth had been waiting for her all along, preserved by love against the day she would need it most. Take a breath and let us continue. The first letter was written in neat, careful handwriting that suggested someone who had learned penmanship when it was still considered an important skill. Dear Mrs. Hayes, I am writing this letter because I cannot bear the weight of guilt and silence any longer, even though I am far too afraid to speak these truths publicly where they might actually matter. I was Reverend Carlton Ashford's secretary for 12 years. I worked in the church office handling correspondence and appointments and maintaining records. I was there in the office on the day he claims Eleanor Hayes came to him and propositioned him inappropriately. I know the truth of what actually happened that day. He called her into his office. I made the appointment myself at his request. I heard him through the door saying inappropriate things to her. Heard his voice take on a tone I had come to recognize because I had heard it before with other women over the years. I heard her clearly and firmly tell him no, heard her say she was engaged to be married, and that what he was suggesting was wrong. I heard her leave quickly, her footsteps almost running down the hallway. He was angry when she left. I could see it in his face when he came out of his office. And within an hour, he was crafting the story he would tell the elders, practicing it in his office where he thought no one could hear him through the walls. I heard everything. I heard him create the lie that would destroy her. I wanted desperately to speak up, to tell someone what I had witnessed, to defend that poor woman who was being destroyed by lies she had no power to fight. But Reverend Ashford controls so much in this town. My husband works for a company where the pastor sits on the board of directors. If I speak against him publicly, we will lose everything. My husband's job, our home, our security. I have 2 children still in school. I have a mother in a nursing home whose care I help pay for. I am ashamed of my cowardice, Mrs. Hayes. I am ashamed that I am choosing my family's safety over defending an innocent woman, but I cannot find the courage to sacrifice everything, even though I know it is the right thing to do. I am sending you this letter because I heard through connections in town that you are Eleanor's grandmother. I hope that somehow this truth can help her, even if I cannot speak it myself where others can hear. Eleanor Hayes is completely innocent. Pastor Ashford is lying deliberately and maliciously. Everything he accused her of doing, he actually did to her. Please forgive me for not being brave enough to say this where it would matter. Please know that at least one person in this town knows the truth and carries the guilt of silence. Opal Jennings. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she finished reading. Evidence. After all these years, actual evidence that she had been telling the truth all along. Someone had witnessed the reality. Someone had documented it, even if they had been too afraid to speak publicly. With trembling hands, she grabbed the second envelope, also addressed to Margaret Hayes, but in completely different handwriting. Postmarked October 1988. Dear Mrs. Hayes, I need you to know what I witnessed. Even though I am too much of a coward to say these things where they might help the woman who needs this testimony. I own the hardware store on Main Street. I was walking past Willowbrook Community Church late one evening in early May of this year, just 2 months before the scandal broke. I had been working late doing inventory and was cutting through the church parking lot as a shortcut to where I had parked my truck. I saw Reverend Ashford following Eleanor Hayes to her car in the parking lot. She was clearly trying to leave, walking quickly, almost running, but he followed her and cornered her by her vehicle. I was too far away to hear their conversation clearly, but I watched him touch her arm repeatedly when she tried to move past him, saw him position himself to block her path, saw him lean in close in a way that was clearly inappropriate and unwanted. I saw her push his hand away, saw her finally manage to get into her car and drive away quickly, like she was escaping. This was several weeks before the scandal broke publicly. I realize now, seeing how everything unfolded, that he was pursuing her persistently and inappropriately, and when she continued to reject him firmly, he destroyed her reputation to protect his own. I wanted desperately to testify to what I had seen, to defend her publicly, to tell everyone that Ashford was the aggressor and Eleanor was the victim. But I have business dealings with several prominent church members. Standing against the pastor publicly would ruin me financially and socially. My wife reminded me that we have children to provide for and a business to protect. She threatened to leave me if I got involved, said I had no right to risk our family's security for a stranger. I hate myself for this cowardice, Mrs. Hayes. I hate that I am choosing financial security over defending an innocent woman, but I have children who depend on me, a mortgage, employees whose families depend on the store staying open. I am sending you this letter as a record of truth, even though I lack the courage to speak it publicly. Maybe somehow, someday it will matter. Maybe somehow it will help Eleanor prove her innocence, even if that day comes far too late. Your friend in shame and regret, Clyde Whitaker. Eleanor stared at the letter, at the name signed clearly at the bottom, at the testimony of a man who had seen the truth and documented it, but had been too afraid to speak. 2 witnesses, 2 people who knew she was innocent, 2 letters that could have saved her reputation and her standing in decades of unjust judgment, but they had been too afraid to speak, and she had never known these letters existed. Her grandmother had known, Maggie had collected them, had preserved them, had hidden them away. Why? But there was something else in the trunk that Eleanor had almost missed. Tucked beneath the tissue paper, yellowed and fragile, was a newspaper clipping from the Mobile Register dated March 1985, 3 years before Eleanor's scandal. The headline made her blood run cold. Beloved pastor leaves First Baptist after personal differences. The article was brief and carefully worded, the kind of local news story that said everything by saying nothing. Reverend Carlton Ashford, age 35, was leaving his position at First Baptist Church of Mobile after 8 years of service. The church board cited personal differences regarding the direction of ministry. Pastor Ashford would be relocating to a new position in Tennessee. No scandal mentioned, no accusations named, no woman's reputation destroyed in print. But Maggie had circled one paragraph in faded ink. Several congregation members expressed surprise at the sudden departure. One anonymous source suggested the decision followed private complaints from multiple women in the congregation, though church leadership declined to comment on personnel matters. He had done this before. Eleanor stared at the clipping, her hands trembling. In Mobile, they had been smart enough or powerful enough or connected enough to force him out quietly. No public scandal, no destroyed reputations, just a quiet departure and a fresh start somewhere new. Somewhere like Willowbrook, where a charming young pastor could rebuild his reputation and continue his pattern with fresh targets who had no idea what he was capable of. She had not been his first victim. She had simply been the first one without enough power to make him leave quietly. The realization should have made her angrier. Instead, it made her calmer, colder, more certain. This was not just about her anymore. This was about every woman he had targeted before her and every woman he might have targeted after. This was about a pattern that had been allowed to continue because powerful people protected their own. Not anymore. The answer to why Maggie had hidden these letters was in the third envelope. The one addressed in handwriting Eleanor recognized instantly. Her grandmother's elegant script, slightly shaky with age, but still distinctive. Addressed simply, "For my beloved Eleanor." Eleanor opened this final letter with tears already streaming down her face, knowing somehow that this would be the hardest one to read. My dearest, precious Eleanor. If you are reading this letter, then I am gone from this world, and you have finally found your way to the sanctuary like I begged you to remember. I am so sorry it took you this long to come here. I am sorry for whatever pain and hardship led you to finally open this trunk, and I am desperately, profoundly sorry that I could not give you these letters when they would have mattered most, when they might have cleared your name and saved your reputation and prevented decades of unjust suffering. By the time these letters found their way to me, carried by people too afraid to speak publicly but unwilling to remain completely silent, the immediate damage was already done. The scandal had already spread like wildfire through Willowbrook. The church wedding had already been canceled. Emmett's family had already turned against you. You and Emmett had already married quietly at the courthouse, already been cast out by Willowbrook society and marked a scandal. I wanted so desperately to give you these letters immediately, to march into that church and shove the truth directly into Pastor Ashford's lying face, to force the elders to acknowledge they had been wrong, to make the whole town see that you were innocent. I made appointments with 3 of the church elders, preparing to present this evidence and demand they clear your name publicly. But then Pastor Ashford found out I had evidence against him. I still do not know how he learned about it. Perhaps one of the letter writer's guilt led them to confess to someone who told someone else. Perhaps he simply had enough power and connections to learn everything that happened in Willowbrook. He seemed to know everything about everyone, but he came to my house personally one evening when I was alone. He was a frightening man when he wanted to be, Eleanor. Charming and pleasant and beloved by the congregation, but underneath that mask was something cold and cruel that most people never saw. He told me in very clear terms that if I tried to use those letters publicly, if I attempted to challenge his word or damage his reputation, he would dedicate himself to destroying what remained of your life completely and thoroughly. He said he would spread even worse rumors, would make sure you could never work in this county again, would make sure Emmett lost his carpentry business entirely, would make your existence so unbearable that you would wish you had never been born. He said it calmly, almost pleasantly, like he was discussing the weather rather than threatening to ruin your entire life. And Eleanor, I believed him completely. He had that kind of power in Willowbrook. He had connections and influence and the unshakable trust of people who mattered. He could have done everything he threatened and more. I was an old woman, already past 80. You were newly married, trying desperately to build some kind of life with Emmett despite everything that had happened. I thought, perhaps foolishly, perhaps correctly, I will never know, that if I stayed quiet and hid the evidence, at least you could have some measure of peace and privacy to build your marriage. I thought that protecting you meant hiding the truth rather than fighting with it and risking even worse consequences. So I sewed these letters into the lining of the wedding dress you never got to wear for the wedding that never happened. And I sealed them away in this sanctuary, where only you would eventually find them. I hoped desperately that you would never need them, that life would be kind to you, that the scandal would gradually fade into irrelevant history, that eventually the truth would not matter because you would be happy and safe and surrounded by people who loved you. But I am writing this final letter on my deathbed, and I am realistic enough to prepare for darker possibilities. If you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. You have lost Emmett, or your children have failed you, or you have lost your home and security. You are alone and desperate, and you need weapons to fight back against a world that has been unjust to you. So here they are, my darling girl. The truth. The evidence that you were completely innocent and that a powerful, cruel man destroyed your reputation to protect himself. The testimony of witnesses who saw what really happened but were too afraid to speak publicly. And the newspaper clipping that proves you were not his first target. I do not know if Pastor Ashford is still alive when you read this. I hope he is long dead and facing whatever judgment awaits liars and abusers. But if he is still living, if the people who believed his lies are still around to hear the truth, then perhaps this evidence can still matter. I do not know if clearing your name decades late will bring you any peace or justice, but I know this with absolute certainty. You deserve so much better than what happened to you. You deserve to have these letters all those years ago. You deserve to have your name cleared publicly and your reputation restored. You deserve to wear this dress at a beautiful wedding in a church filled with people who loved you. I failed you by staying silent when I should have fought. I chose caution over courage, and you paid the price for my cowardice. I can never apologize enough for that failure. But maybe even this late, truth can still matter. Maybe evidence can still make a difference. Maybe justice delayed is still worth pursuing. Use these letters, Eleanor. Tell the truth publicly. Make people listen to evidence instead of rumors. If there is any justice left in this world, any decency, any fairness, let it finally find you. I love you more than I ever found words to express. I am sorry I was not brave enough when bravery mattered most. But maybe my cowardice can be redeemed if this truth eventually helps you reclaim the dignity that was stolen. Your grandmother who failed you but never stopped loving you, Margaret Hayes. Eleanor sat in that basement for a long time. The letters lay scattered around her. The wedding dress was draped across her lap. The newspaper clipping rested on top of the pile. The flashlight cast long shadows on the stone walls. And Eleanor cried. She cried for the young woman she had been, who had her reputation destroyed by lies. She cried for her grandmother, who had wanted to help, but had been too afraid. She cried for Emmett, who had stood by her and paid the price. She cried for decades of carrying a burden that was never hers to bear, of being whispered about and judged and isolated for something she had never done. She cried for the wedding that should have been beautiful, and the marriage that should have been celebrated, and the life that should have been free from this shadow of undeserved disgrace. She cried until she had no more tears, until the grief and rage and pain had poured out of her and left her empty and somehow strangely clear-headed. Then, with her tears still drying on her weathered face, she carefully gathered the letters and the newspaper clipping and folded them back into their envelopes. She picked up the wedding dress and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of decades of waiting. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple through the open basement door. And Eleanor Mitchell felt something she had not felt in decades: purpose. Because Reverend Carlton Ashford, she knew from occasional town gossip that still reached even her isolated life, was still alive, still living in Willowbrook, still respected and admired, still powerful at 74 years old, still attending Sunday services, still treated like a community treasure. And tomorrow was Saturday, which meant the day after tomorrow was Sunday, which meant in 48 hours the whole town would be gathered in one place. And Eleanor had a truth to tell that was decades overdue. Eleanor has the evidence in her hands, proof of her innocence after all these years of unjust judgment. She could take these letters to a lawyer quietly, could pursue justice through proper legal channels, could protect herself from public scrutiny and potential embarrassment. Or she could do what her heart is telling her to do, walk into that town square in the dress she never got to wear, and demand the truth be heard by everyone who judged her. What would you do? What would give you peace after decades of carrying weight that was never yours? Think about it, because Eleanor has already made her decision. Eleanor spent that night in the basement sanctuary, wrapped in blankets she had brought in her suitcase, planning her approach with the careful precision of someone who had spent 50 years doing detail-oriented work. She knew exactly how Willowbrook worked. She had lived there for 40 years, most of them as an outsider looking in. She knew when people gathered, where crowds assembled, how information spread through the town like water finding its own level. Sunday service at Willowbrook Community Church began at 10 o'clock in the morning, but before service, at 9 o'clock sharp, there was fellowship hour in the town square adjacent to the church, a beloved tradition that had continued for generations. Church members and townspeople gathered around coffee and pastries for socializing before heading to worship together. It would be crowded with people, public and visible, full of potential witnesses, perfect for what Eleanor needed to do. But she understood something crucial. She needed to look like someone who deserved to be heard. The clothes she had been allowed to keep were worn and shabby, the belongings of a poor elderly woman who looked exactly like what she was: desperate, evicted, homeless. No one would listen to someone who looked defeated and powerless. They would dismiss her as confused or crazy or simply irrelevant. She needed to look dignified, needed to present herself as someone whose words carried weight and whose truth mattered. She needed to look like the woman she had been before the scandal destroyed her: confident, capable, someone who demanded respect simply by existing. Eleanor examined the wedding dress carefully in the beam of her flashlight, running her experienced fingers over the fabric and construction. It was decades old, but Maggie's meticulous preservation had kept it remarkably beautiful. The ivory silk still had its soft luster. The delicate lace applique still held its intricate pattern. The fitted bodice and flowing skirt were classic enough that they did not look absurdly dated. It was clearly a wedding dress, yes, and wearing a wedding dress to confront her accuser might seem theatrical or strange, but it was also the most dignified, beautiful, powerful garment Eleanor owned, and there was a symbolic rightness to it, wearing the dress she had never gotten to wear to the wedding that had been stolen from her, wearing evidence of what had been taken as armor while she reclaimed what was owed. With her seamstress's considerable skill, Eleanor could modify the dress to make it less obviously bridal while keeping its dignity and beauty intact. She worked through the night by flashlight, her elderly fingers still surprisingly nimble and precise from 50 years of detailed needlework. She carefully removed the train, shortening the back to a more practical length. She detached the small veil that had been tucked in the trunk. She altered the neckline slightly to be less romantic and more dignified. She found a light shawl in her suitcase and modified it to drape over her shoulders like an elegant wrap. By the time dawn light began filtering through the basement door, she had created something remarkable. A dress that no longer screamed wedding, but instead whispered dignity, grace, intention, importance. A dress that said its wearer was someone who mattered, someone who had taken care with her appearance because she had something important to say. Eleanor bathed as best she could using water from a jug she had filled at a public pump the previous day. She took care to be as clean and presentable as possible. She did her hair carefully, pinning her white curls into a neat, elegant style that added to rather than detracted from her age. She dressed in the modified gown. And when she examined herself in a small, compact mirror, she saw not a defeated elderly woman, but someone who looked like she had profound truths to speak and the strength to speak them. At 8:45 on Sunday morning, Eleanor Mitchell walked toward Willowbrook's town square, carrying the 3 letters and the newspaper clipping in a simple cloth bag, wearing a modified wedding dress that was decades old, heading toward a confrontation that was long overdue. The square was already filling with people when she arrived. Church members and families, young and old, gathered in the pleasant morning sunshine with coffee cups and conversations. Children ran between the adults, their laughter bright against the murmur of grown-up talk. Elderly couples sat on the benches that lined the square, greeting neighbors they had known for decades. The smell of fresh pastries from the church's hospitality committee drifted through the air. Eleanor saw familiar faces everywhere, people who had judged her all those years ago, people who had whispered about her and turned away from her and denied her their respect and their business, people who had refused to give her the benefit of the doubt, people who had chosen to believe a charming liar over a woman whose only crime was rejecting his advances. She saw her own 3 children there. Clayton stood with his wife and teenage son near the coffee table, laughing at something a colleague had said. Nadine was deep in conversation with a group of women her age, gesturing animatedly about something that was clearly very important to her. Wesley held his 9-year-old daughter Rosie by the hand, pointing out something in the trees while his wife stood nearby checking her phone. They had not noticed her yet, had not seen their evicted mother approaching in a vintage gown. And at the center of one of the largest groups, holding court like the beloved elder statesman he had successfully pretended to be for nearly 4 decades, stood Reverend Carlton Ashford. He was 74 years old now, white-haired and slightly stooped with age, but still possessing that charismatic presence that had made him so powerful and dangerous. People clustered around him attentively, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, treating him like the respected community treasure he had never actually been. He was wearing a well-tailored suit. His smile was warm and grandfatherly. His eyes crinkled pleasantly when he chuckled at his own wit. And Eleanor felt something crystallize inside her that had been forming all night. This man had stolen decades of her life, had destroyed her reputation with calculated lies, had threatened her grandmother into silence, had lived in comfort and respect while she carried weight that was never hers, and he had never paid any price for any of it. Until now. Eleanor walked straight toward him through the crowd, moving with purpose and dignity. People noticed her dress first. The unusual vintage beauty of it made heads turn, made conversations pause. A woman in white moving through the Sunday morning crowd like something from another era. Then they began recognizing her face, and whispers started spreading through the square like ripples across water. Is that Eleanor Mitchell? What is she doing here dressed like that? Why would she come to fellowship hour? Someone should probably call security. Eleanor stopped directly in front of Reverend Carlton Ashford, close enough that he had to look at her, close enough that everyone around could hear what she was about to say. He looked up from his conversation, mild curiosity on his face shifting to recognition, and then for just one fraction of a second before he controlled his expression, something else, fear. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by a mask of pleasant confusion. But Eleanor had seen it. He recognized her. He recognized the dress, or at least what it represented, and some part of him, buried under decades of successful deception, was afraid of what she might say. Good. Reverend Ashford. Eleanor's voice carried clearly through the increasingly quiet square, steady and strong despite her racing heart. I have something that belongs to you, something that has been waiting a very long time to be delivered. She reached into her bag and pulled out the letters and the newspaper clipping, holding them up so the assembled crowd could see them clearly. In 1988, Eleanor continued, her voice carrying over the now silent crowd, you told this town that I had inappropriately propositioned you. You claimed I had tried to seduce you. You said I was a woman of poor character who should not be allowed to marry in your church. People were moving closer now. Phone cameras were appearing. The crowd was pressing in, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. And this town believed you without question, Eleanor went on, because you were a pastor, powerful and respected and trusted, and I was just a seamstress with no family connections, no power, no way to defend myself, because you were important, and I was nobody. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But you lied. Ashford's face had gone pale, but his voice remained controlled when he spoke. This is ridiculous. This woman has been telling these same lies for decades. She is clearly confused and unwell. Someone should really help her find appropriate care. You pursued me, Eleanor continued, ignoring his interruption. Her voice cut through his attempted dismissal like a blade through silk. You cornered me in your office and made inappropriate suggestions. You followed me to my car in the church parking lot and touched me when I tried to leave. You made me deeply uncomfortable repeatedly, and when I rejected you clearly, firmly, repeatedly, you were angry. She held up the first letter. So you decided to destroy my reputation before I could damage yours. You lied to protect yourself, and you destroyed my life to save your own. This is absolutely ridiculous, Ashford said again, but his voice was shaking slightly now, lacking the confident authority he usually commanded. I have evidence, Eleanor said. I have letters from people who witnessed the truth, people who saw what you actually did, people who were too afraid of you to speak publicly, but who documented the truth because their consciences would not allow them to remain completely silent while you destroyed an innocent woman. She held up the first letter. Your own secretary witnessed you calling me into your office. Opal Jennings heard you saying inappropriate things to me through the door. She heard me clearly telling you no, heard me say I was engaged and leaving. She heard you being angry when I rejected you, and she heard you crafting your lies afterward, practicing the story you would tell the elders to destroy me. The crowd had gone completely silent. Not a single voice, not a single movement, just 200 people watching this drama unfold before them. Eleanor held up the second letter, and Clyde Whitaker, who owned the hardware store for 40 years, witnessed you following me to the church parking lot one evening in May of 1988. He saw you corner me by my car. He saw you touching me repeatedly when I tried to leave. He saw me push you away before I could finally escape. This was weeks before you publicly accused me. He saw you pursuing me. He documented it, even though he was too afraid of your power to testify publicly. Ashford's face had gone from pale to gray, the color draining as he realized she had actual evidence, actual documentation, actual proof. Eleanor held up the newspaper clipping. And this is from the Mobile Register, March 1985, 3 years before you came to Willowbrook. It says you left your previous church in Alabama after personal differences. But there were rumors, were there not, complaints from multiple women in that congregation. You were not forced to confess. You were just quietly moved along, given a fresh start, a new town full of new targets who had no idea what you were capable of. She held up the final letter. And this letter is from my grandmother, Margaret Hayes. She explains how you came to her house personally when she tried to bring this evidence forward, how you threatened her, how you told her you would completely destroy what remained of my life if she dared to challenge your lies publicly, how you used your power and influence to silence an old woman who was trying to protect her granddaughter from injustice. She looked around at the crowd, seeing faces she had known for decades, seeing shock and confusion and the beginning of understanding. I am not here asking you to simply take my word over his, Eleanor said. I am here to provide you with documented evidence from multiple witnesses that was silenced by fear and power all those years ago. She turned back to Ashford. Her voice became quieter, but somehow even more powerful in its intensity. I want you to tell the truth. Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses who trusted you and believed you and defended you for decades. Did you lie about me? Did you pursue me inappropriately when I was engaged to be married? Did you destroy my reputation because I rejected your advances? Did you steal my wedding and my dignity and decades of my life to protect yourself from the consequences of your own behavior? The silence was absolute, suffocating. Ashford stood there, looking at the letters in Eleanor's hands, looking at the newspaper clipping that proved she was not his first target, looking at the crowd of people watching him with growing suspicion, looking at the woman he had tried to destroy all those years ago, now standing in front of him dressed in the wedding gown she had never gotten to wear to the wedding he had canceled. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His voice broke completely. You do not understand the full situation. I was young and made mistakes, but I had a family to protect, a position in the community. I had to protect. Did you lie? Eleanor repeated, her voice absolutely unwavering. Did you destroy an innocent woman's life to protect yourself? Yes or no? Ashford looked at her, looked at the letters, looked at the newspaper clipping, looked at the crowd of people who had trusted him for decades, and something in him finally broke. Yes, the word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Yes, he said again, louder, his voice cracking. I pursued you inappropriately. You rejected me repeatedly and clearly. I was angry and felt humiliated, so I lied to the church elders. I told them you had pursued me when the truth was exactly the opposite. I destroyed your reputation to protect mine. I am sorry. God help me. I have lived with that guilt for decades. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in shock and disbelief. People turned to each other, processing what they had just witnessed. Some faces showed anger, some showed confusion, some showed the beginning of shame for all the years they had participated in judging an innocent woman. Eleanor saw Clayton pushing through the crowd toward her, his face absolutely stunned. Mom, his voice was barely audible over the growing noise. All these years, you were telling the truth. Everything you said, it was all real. Eleanor looked at her oldest son, the child she had raised, the man who had evicted her from her home just 2 days ago, the person who had never quite believed her, never quite trusted her, never quite been willing to defend her. All these years, she confirmed quietly, I tried to tell you, I tried to tell all of you, but you never quite believed me, did you? You never quite trusted that I was innocent, because a respected pastor had accused me, and I was just your embarrassing mother with the shameful past that you wished would go away. Nadine was crying now, pushing through to reach Eleanor's side. Mom, I am so sorry. We should have believed you. We should have defended you. You should have helped me when I was being evicted, Eleanor said. Her voice was hard despite the tears she could feel threatening. You should have cared enough about me to not let me end up homeless at 72, but you did not. You laughed at me when I said I was going to find shelter in a basement. You assumed I was defeated and pathetic, and you walked away. She looked at each of her 3 children in turn. Clayton with his expensive suit and his accounting degree, Nadine with her sales manager title and her constant travel, Wesley with his banking job and his young family. All of them successful, all of them comfortable, all of them standing there with the dawning realization that they had failed their mother in every way that mattered. So I had to save myself, Eleanor continued. I had to find my grandmother's letters and clear my own name and fight my own battle, like I have been doing my entire life, fighting alone, because the people who should have stood beside me chose not to. She turned back to the crowd, raising her voice to address everyone gathered. I am not asking for your money or your pity. I am not asking for anything except this one simple thing. Let my name be cleared. Let it be known and remembered and acknowledged that Eleanor Mitchell was innocent of the charges made against her, that she was wrongly accused by a man who abused his power, that she lived decades carrying weight that was never hers. Let that be the truth that this town finally acknowledges. She looked at Ashford one final time, this elderly man who had stolen so much from her. You get to live with what you did. You get to explain to your children and grandchildren and this community why you destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect yourself. You get to face whatever conscience you still possess after decades of maintaining a lie. She paused. But you do not get to keep the lie anymore. The truth is out now, documented and witnessed and undeniable, and it is staying out. Then Eleanor Mitchell turned and walked away from the crowd, her head held high, the modified wedding dress flowing behind her like a banner of dignity reclaimed. Behind her, she heard the eruption of voices, some still defending Ashford out of habit and discomfort with change, some expressing outrage at him, some calling her name, wanting to apologize, wanting to explain, wanting to somehow make things right. She did not stop walking. She did not turn back. She walked steadily out of the town square, past the gawking faces and the pointed phones and the chaos she had created, back toward the sanctuary that had given her the weapons she needed to fight. And for the first time in decades, Eleanor Mitchell felt something she had almost forgotten existed: peace. The aftermath came with surprising speed and overwhelming force. By Sunday evening, someone's cell phone video of Eleanor's confrontation with Reverend Ashford had been posted online. By Monday morning, it had been shared thousands of times. By Tuesday, it was being picked up by regional news outlets. 72-year-old woman confronts pastor who destroyed her life decades ago. Read the headlines. Elderly woman provides evidence she was innocent of long ago scandal. Pastor finally admits lies that ruined woman's reputation. The video showed everything. Eleanor in her modified wedding dress, beautiful and dignified despite her 72 years. Her voice steady and clear as she presented her evidence. Ashford's face crumbling as he realized he could no longer maintain his lies. His admission of guilt, the crowd's shocked reaction. It was exactly the kind of story that resonated with audiences. An underdog vindicated, a liar exposed, justice delayed but not denied. By Wednesday, news crews from 3 different regional stations had tracked Eleanor down to Margaret's old property. They wanted interviews with the elderly woman living in a basement who had finally cleared her name. Eleanor let them come. She let them see the basement sanctuary where she had found the letters. Let them photograph the trunk and the dress. Let them document the humble circumstances she had been reduced to through family abandonment. She told her story calmly and clearly, showed them the letters, showed them the newspaper clipping, explained the decades of unjust judgment, described what it was like to be evicted by your own children, detailed what it meant to be 72 years old with nowhere to go, except a hole in the ground that your grandmother had prepared for exactly this possibility. The story resonated powerfully. An elderly woman wrongly accused, finally vindicated, abandoned by her own children, living in poverty despite her innocence, fighting back with nothing but truth and determination. People were outraged on her behalf and inspired by her courage. Reverend Carlton Ashford's carefully constructed reputation collapsed completely within a week. The charitable foundation he had led for 20 years demanded his immediate resignation. The community organizations he had served on asked him to step down. The church that had believed his lies all those years ago issued a formal public apology to Eleanor, acknowledging they had failed her and offering to make whatever amends were possible. People who had shunned Eleanor for decades suddenly wanted to talk to her, wanted to apologize, wanted somehow to make up for years of unjust treatment. Eleanor accepted some of these apologies graciously. Others she rejected firmly. She had earned, through suffering, the right to decide who genuinely deserved her forgiveness and who was simply trying to feel better about themselves. Her children came to her on Thursday, all 3 of them together, looking genuinely ashamed in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "Mom," Clayton's voice sounded like he had been crying. "We need to talk about everything that happened, about how we treated you, about the eviction and leaving you with nowhere to go, about not believing you for so many years." "Yes," Eleanor agreed simply, "we do need to talk about all of that." "We found you an apartment," Nadine said quickly, speaking rapidly as if speed would somehow make up for cruelty. "A really nice place. 2 bedrooms, good neighborhood. We will pay the first year's rent completely, help you move your things, get you furniture, whatever you need." "No?" The word landed between them like a wall. "What?" Wesley looked genuinely confused. "But you cannot stay here in this basement." "We are trying to help you now. We are trying to make up for—" "I do not want your guilt money," Eleanor said clearly. "I do not want you to swoop in now that I have publicly cleared my name and made you look like failures as children. I do not want you to suddenly rescue me because it makes you feel better about yourselves or because you are embarrassed by how bad you look in the news coverage." "Then what do you want from us?" Clayton asked, and something in his voice suggested he genuinely did not understand. Eleanor looked at her 3 children, these people she had carried and birthed and raised and sacrificed everything for, these people who had failed her when she needed them most. "I want you to truly understand something important," she said. "For decades, you had a choice every single day to believe me or believe the rumors about me. You consistently chose to believe the rumors, even though I was your mother, even though I had never given you any reason to doubt my character." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "When I desperately needed help last week, when I was being evicted and had nowhere to go, you had a choice to stand by me or abandon me. You chose abandonment. You laughed at me when I came to this basement for shelter. You assumed I was defeated and pathetic, and you walked away feeling relieved that the problem had solved itself." The 3 of them stood in silence, unable to deny what she was saying. "I saved myself," Eleanor continued. "I found my grandmother's evidence. I cleared my own name publicly. I stood up in that town square completely alone. alone and fought for my own dignity while you watched from the crowd, not because you helped me or supported me or believed in me, despite the fact that you did not do any of those things. We know, Nadine whispered, tears streaming. We know we failed you completely. That is why we are here. We want to make it right. You cannot make decades right, Eleanor said, not cruelly, but simply stating truth. You cannot go back and choose differently when it would have actually mattered. But here is what I want going forward. She looked at each of them in turn. I want you to know and acknowledge that you failed me profoundly, and I want you to understand that any relationship we have from this point forward is not because I need you or depend on you for survival. It is because I am choosing, out of grace and forgiveness that you frankly do not deserve, to give you a chance to earn back trust that you destroyed. Her voice remained steady. If you want to be part of my life now, it will be on my terms, not as my rescuers riding in to save poor helpless elderly me, but as my children who owe me a massive debt of respect and trust and care, and who need to work very hard to prove they are capable of providing those things consistently over time. The three of them stood in silence, and Eleanor saw what looked like genuine understanding beginning to dawn in their expressions. Can we earn back your trust? Clayton asked quietly. His voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. Can you ever forgive us enough to let us try? This is the moment that matters most. Eleanor's children are standing before her, asking for forgiveness. The same children who laughed when she said she would live in a basement. The same children who chose convenience over compassion. The same children who never believed her. If you were Eleanor, what would you say? Would you forgive them because they are your children and forgiveness is what mothers do? Would you turn them away because some betrayals are too deep to overcome? Or would you find something in between, some path that honors both your pain and your hope? Take a moment. Think about the people in your own life who have failed you. Think about what forgiveness would mean, what it would cost, what it might give back. Because Eleanor has thought about this for a long time, and she has made her choice. I do not know, Eleanor answered honestly, but you are welcome to try, and we will see over time whether you are capable of being the children I needed you to be all along. A lawyer reached out to Eleanor the following week. Pro bono, she explained when she called, because Eleanor's case had moved her deeply after seeing the news coverage. Reverend Carlton Ashford, it turned out, had been considerably wealthy through inheritance and decades of careful investments. The lies he had told about Eleanor all those years ago had directly cost her business, income, social connections, and countless opportunities throughout her life. There was, the lawyer explained carefully, a very strong case for a civil lawsuit seeking damages for defamation, emotional distress, and economic harm spanning nearly 4 decades. Eleanor thought about it carefully overnight. She was not a vindictive person by nature. She had never wanted revenge, had only wanted truth and dignity, had only wanted to stop carrying a burden that was never hers. But she was also 72 years old, currently living in a basement with almost nothing to her name, facing years ahead with no financial security and no guarantee that her children would actually follow through on their promises to be better. Principle was important, but so was practical survival. File it, she told the lawyer when she called back. The case moved quickly once filed, Ashford facing complete public disgrace and confronted with clear documentary evidence of his lies and their consequences, did not fight the lawsuit. His lawyers negotiated a settlement within 6 weeks. The amount was substantial, not millions, but enough that Eleanor could buy a modest house outright, live comfortably for the rest of her life without financial worry, and still have something meaningful to leave to future generations. She did not buy anything fancy or impressive, just a small cottage on the outskirts of Willowbrook with 2 bedrooms, a garden space, and excellent natural light for sewing. She started taking in alterations work again, and this time people came to her with respect rather than whispered judgment, with apologies rather than suspicious glances. The wedding dress, the one she had never worn, the one her grandmother had used to preserve and protect the truth. Eleanor had it professionally cleaned and preserved in a special archival frame. She hung it on her living room wall as a daily reminder, not of what had been stolen from her, but of what she had reclaimed through courage and evidence and refusing to stay silent. 7 months after the confrontation in the town square, Eleanor stood in her small garden planting tulip bulbs for the spring. The autumn sun was warm on her face. The soil was rich and dark in her hands. She was 73 now. She had lost decades to lies and injustice. She had been evicted by her own children. She had been homeless and desperate and forced to live in a basement. And through all of that, she had saved herself. She had found the truth her grandmother had preserved for her like seeds, waiting for the right season to finally grow. She had stood up to power with nothing but evidence and dignity. She had reclaimed her name and her reputation. She had proven that even at 72, even starting with absolutely nothing, strength and truth could still triumph. The doorbell rang, interrupting her gardening. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and went inside, expecting perhaps a customer dropping off alterations or a neighbor returning a borrowed dish. Instead, she found Wesley standing on her porch, holding the hand of a small girl, Rosie, 9 years old now, bright eyes and curious expression. She was wearing a hand-knitted sweater that Eleanor recognized because she had made it 3 years ago for a birthday gift before everything fell apart. "Hi, Mom." Wesley's voice was nervous but genuinely hopeful. "I was hoping. Rosie has been asking about you ever since she saw you on the news. She thinks you are incredibly brave." He paused. "And she mentioned wanting to learn to sew, like you do. So I was wondering if you had time this afternoon to maybe teach her some basics, if you are willing." Eleanor looked at her youngest son, saw genuine effort in his eyes, real regret, the beginning of what might eventually become understanding. She looked at her granddaughter, saw curiosity and admiration and no trace of the judgment or shame that older generations had carried for decades. She thought about holding on to anger forever, about making them pay indefinitely for their failures. And then she thought about her grandmother Margaret, who had preserved truth and evidence not out of vengeance, but out of love, who had protected Eleanor even from beyond death, because that was what real love did, who had understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is plant seeds for a future you might not live to see. "Come in," Eleanor said, stepping aside to let them enter her home. Then, because forgiveness was also a form of strength, and because grudges hurt the person carrying them more than anyone else, "I will teach Rosie to sew, and while I do, I will tell her the complete story of a wedding dress that held the truth for decades until it was finally needed. She should know where she comes from. She should understand what her great-great-grandmother did to protect me. She should learn that truth always matters, even when it takes decades to finally emerge." Wesley nodded, tears visible in his eyes. "Thank you, Mom, for giving us another chance, for being willing to let us try to earn back what we threw away." Eleanor smiled at little Rosie, who was looking up at her with those wide, curious eyes. "Come on, sweetheart, let me show you something beautiful." She led the girl to her sewing room, where the light was golden through the windows, and her grandmother's old sewing machine sat waiting to create again. "Well, let me teach you how patient hands and careful work can create something that lasts. And let me tell you a story about why truth and dignity matter more than anything else in this world." Rosie looked up at her grandmother. "Will you teach me to make a dress like the one in the picture?" Eleanor looked at the framed wedding dress on the wall, the dress that had waited decades to tell its story, the dress that had saved her when she needed saving most. "Yes," she said. "But first, I need to tell you why that dress matters, and why your great-great-grandmother Margaret was one of the bravest women who ever lived, and why it is never too late to tell the truth, even when the whole world tells you to stay silent." She sat down at the sewing machine, settled Rosie on a stool beside her, and began to teach her granddaughter the first stitches. Outside the window, autumn leaves drifted down in the afternoon light. Inside the cottage, an old woman and a young girl bent their heads together over fabric and thread, one generation passing wisdom to another, and the wedding dress watched over them from its frame on the wall. A reminder that truth does not expire, that evidence preserved with love can wait patiently for decades, that dignity can be reclaimed no matter how long it has been stolen, and that it is never ever too late to stand up and speak the truth. If Eleanor's story touched something deep in your heart, if you have ever been accused of something you did not do, if you have ever carried the weight of lies others told about you, if you have ever wondered whether it is too late to clear your name and reclaim what was stolen, I want you to know something important. The truth does not have an expiration date. Evidence preserved with love can wait for the right moment, even if that moment is decades away. Even at 72, even when you have lost absolutely everything, you can still fight for justice and win. And dignity does not come from what others think of you. It comes from standing up for yourself and speaking truth even when no one else will stand beside you. Thank you for staying with Eleanor through her entire journey. Thank you for believing that truth still matters in a world that often seems to reward lies. And if there is someone in your life who has been unfairly judged, who has carried shame they did not deserve, who has been waiting for someone to believe them, maybe this story can help, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen to the truth, and sometimes that person has to be ourselves. The end.